our next session, which I guarantee will be a treat. So please be seated, and we'll start. And it is wonderful to be introducing Josie Appleton. First of all, because she is a friend, and she's a wonderful person, and she is one of the founders of a very exciting movement that has sprung up on the English political scene 3 years ago, called the Manifesto Club. And if you are among the very few people who haven't heard about it, because the Manifesto Club has been very active organizing campaigns, and most recently the one against vetting for people who are dealing with vulnerable adults, children, and so on. If you haven't heard of it, manifestoclub.org is where you want to go when you leave this building this evening. Josie is the convener of the Manifesto Club. We organize, besides campaigns, we organize pub nights and quizzes and a lot of funny things. And they publish books and reports. The latest book, called the EU Phrase Book, 27 Ways to Say No, which doesn't really mean no, is here. There is a copy here that you can browse through. And it is appropriate that Josie brought this, because she is going to give us a libertarian critique of the European Union. Josie.
I'm not sure it's classified as a libertarian critique, the libertarian critique, it's one libertarian critique. So, yeah, and I guess the reflections that I'm going to look at are really things that come out of our experience over the past 3 years of launching campaigns on what we see as the new freedom issues, the new ways in which the state is interfering in more and more private spaces. So with the vetting law, the booze bans, rules on speech, what word you can use. So kind of really looking at the new kinds of freedom issues and trying to find the points at which people's aspirations and desires come into conflict with the state and state regulation, and the point at which you can therefore make freedom issues come to life, and have a popular campaign where people can see why you're doing it and they can support the cause, and develop start to develop more of an understanding of the danger of expansive state regulation in the current climate. So that's really what the club's trying to do. And this book was really, we launched this just before the EU meeting about trying to deal with Ireland after the Irish no vote. And we basically collected all the different ways in which European politicians said after all the no votes, this is why this vote doesn't mean no. You know, people didn't understand the treaty, or they were confused, or this is dangerous, or all the different ways. Even some EU politicians said that the no votes will create the danger of another Holocaust, because this is a sign of fascism, rejecting this document. So I mean, I think that. So trying to understand what the EU means as a body, as a new kind of political body, but also trying to think through it from the point of view of a campaigner, so as someone who's very much trying to bring new freedom issues to life and to work out ways in which you can make these questions clear and live issues for people. So I mean, it's obviously a kind of a common English national kind of stereotype of the EU, that you have this monolithic organisation in Brussels, which creates all these laws, and these are then foisted as a foreign oppressive force on this free country of ours, and taking away liberty. So we were free, and then there was Brussels, and now we're not. So that's a kind of caricature which which has some kind of resonance here. Now, I mean, I think for me, everything that Europe has done ever has also been done by local, national political organisations. So I don't think that Brussels is some kind of foreign, different kind of politics. I think that all the things you see Brussels doing, you also see local councils doing, you see national politicians doing. So I think that the way that Brussels works is very much connected with national political scenes. So yes, Europe has banned Swedish marbles, it's banned various kinds of French cheese, it stopped Bulgarians from killing their pigs. But then last summer, Italian councils banned sandcastles and bikinis. UK councils have banned standing up in pubs. They've required that pubs get licenses for dancing, singing, even for, they call it a spoken word license, which is necessary to have poetry readings in the club or the pub. And UK MPs are currently exercised about the question of banning cigarette vending machines and the display of cigarettes in newsagents, which the MP bringing this through says that this ban is making history. So I think that everything that Europe has done, councils have done too, MPs have done too. There's very much a kind of common understanding. And when you have an EU directive which forces councils to do something, you don't see any conflict there. You don't see councillors standing up and saying, oh, this is really terrible that we're made to do this. So something about the EU landfill quotas, which means that councils have to force you to organise your rubbish into 6 different boxes, and the boxes keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Councils love this stuff. There's no conflict of interest there. There's very much a commonality of temper, the way that they view residents is very much of the same spirit as Brussels. So I think that the thing about Brussels is that it is an outgrowth and a response that changes within national political cultures. It's not a foreign imposition upon countries, but it's, I guess, a kind of extreme or purified expression of a kind of technocratic, regulatory, petty politics, which has become common in countries across Europe. And what you see throughout the 1990s is that the more that domestic politics became technocratic, the more that Brussels took over decision-making. So it was in the 1990s that you had European organisations first started to decide issues like crime, energy policy, criminal justice, the things that had been questions for national debate and discussion started to be taken over by Brussels at the very time that those national political spheres started to become emptied out. And it was only when those national political spheres became technocratic that it could be a question decided by technocrats elsewhere. So I think that Brussels is an outgrowth of changes that have happened in countries all across Europe. It's very much a response to that, and not this sort of this foreign imposition on national politics. I think that the thing that Europe really represents is it's a political sphere for elites. It's a place where national politicians and national elites can negotiate policy as a private club. It's a kind of, the European club is really a kind of private members club for the political elites of Europe. And this becomes their political sphere. It becomes their audience. It becomes the place they get political ideas. It becomes their source of pressure and influence. And one of the sort of themes that ran throughout politicians' responses to the no votes was they said, oh, this will isolate us in the European club. This will destroy our position in the European club. And the worst thing for them that they could imagine was not that they would be isolated from their electorates, but they would be isolated in the European club. And I think what that showed is really how Brussels has become its own political sphere, and in a way that could only happen as politicians become more isolated from their own electorates. So this political sphere has a form of politics that is done in private. So all the mechanisms and the way that European institutions work is they're intensely private, and all these very elaborate ways of preventing the public from knowing what happened in a meeting or what was discussed. So you have no reporting of meetings in the European Council. You have documents that are limited, that are literally non-reports, they don't exist. And you have essentially ways of discussing and making policy that are deliberately shielded from the public, deliberately preventing people from actually knowing what was going on, and making that process deliberately obtuse. This is a form of politics also, so that's the first feature of it is politics done in private. The second feature is it's a form of politics based not on conflict, an argument and different positions, but it's based on consensus and creating the consensus, harmonizing policies, you know, and so disagreements are treated as an unspeakable breach of etiquette. Like the worst thing you can say in the EU is, I really, really disagree with what you just said. Because there's a sort of hush in the room. It's almost like you've just kind of burped or something, because to disagree is terribly uncouth. And, you know, so the whole basis of political argument, which is opposition, criticism, passion, all those things are blanded out in this way of talking about politics, which is harmonization, consensus. And if there is conflict, and it's the conflict of the private members club. So it's the question now that they're all arguing about who's going to get, you know, the presidency or the foreign minister position or whatever. So it's essentially it's the boys jostling for jobs. In the same way that in a private members club you jostle for who's going to be the speaker or who's going to take care of the coffee or whatever. So I think that the conflict is interpersonal, and it's not political, not based on political positions. I think that the nature of the EU as a private members club was revealed with the Czech presidency, because he broke all the rules. He didn't play the game, and you know he was terribly rude. They had an opening art exhibition which included representation of Lithuania as a urinal or something, and you know, and he didn't respect Sarkozy, and he essentially just. He said what he thought, and he also very much had his eye on his own electorate. And the sort of shock within the European Club was absolutely like an electric charge for the whole period of the presidency. They just didn't know how to deal with this, and they tried to deal with this by sending some EU kind of representatives to see him, and he actually published a transcript of this meeting, which had very much the flavour of getting visited by a mafia boss. They apparently got a European flag and they slammed it on his desk and they said, "This is the flag, do you not recognise it?" And basically it was total, like getting visited by a bunch of heavies. But that was because he broke the rules of the club. He didn't play it like a private elite club. He played it as a man with political ideas, with certain kind of ties with his electorate. So I think that he really revealed European politics for what it is. So I think what you're having is a new kind of European culture, a new kind of European politics, which is not European in any genuine sense. So it's not like the Renaissance or the Enlightenment or the alliance of the left or the right or whatever, where Europeans would become allied on various issues or whatever. It's very much a new European culture, which is a culture entirely constructed, created by an elite. And I've been to these new European meetings, and you see a sort of process of socialization taking place of Eastern Europeans. And they learn to talk about binge drinking, social inclusion, hate speech, climate change, and that's the process of them becoming European, learning to say that, use these words and express these opinions. And so it's a kind of deracinated political culture, which is based purely on the elite and its kind of mechanisms of talking to itself. And I think what you have really is in a funny way, politics starts to become very similar all over Europe. So places with very different actual civic or political cultures can pass the same laws. So something like the smoking ban can get passed, through kind of French cafes, Italian bars, Spanish bars. Places with very different civic cultures get the same law. And there's a process within Brussels of it becoming known that to become European you pass a smoking ban. And there was no EU law on smoking, but it became known that was the thing that you did. And so very quickly, all around Europe, the same law got passed. So I think that's the main thing that the EU represents. It's an outgrowth from changes in national political cultures. increasingly technocratic, petty. And it means that it's essentially a private elite club, a way of doing politics, where members of the elite negotiate among themselves about how best to manage their publics. The European Constitution, the Lisbon Treaty, was very much a moment of political clarity. And it was really a moment, I think, when this whole way in which the EU operated became very clear. It shone a real light on the inner workings of the EU and the fact that it's become a private club for national politicians. Because this was a treaty, it was supposed to be a political document, but it was not supposed to be read. Some of the people who drafted it actually said we made it deliberately difficult in order that people would not read it and therefore would not know what it was saying. And even in Ireland, some of the politicians said, you don't have to read this, I haven't read it actually. You know, politicians admitted that they hadn't read this document, and the Irish public did not need to read it, they just had to trust them that this was a sensible thing. And so the whole process of the referendum was really a process of asking people to say yes, on faith, to this political document which could not be read, could not be understood, and was not meant to be read or understood. And it was a process of asking for affirmation. And whenever people said no, then this no vote was experienced as a violation of the treaty. So some of the things that politicians said was they said that the no vote has endangered the treaty. It's blocking the process of European reform. This is an obstacle for politics. Even it's an obstacle for democratic reform of the EU. A lot of European politicians said, well, this is trying to make the EU more democratic, and therefore the no vote is blocking democracy and blocking the democratization of the EU. Richard Corbett said that there is no plan B. If there was a plan B, its very existence would affect plan A, which is to ratify the treaty. So, I think that the whole idea that there is no plan B is very telling, because politics is about having plan B, and plan A and plan C. And if you choose plan A, it's because you've considered all the alternatives, and you've gone for the best one, and that's why plan A is the right thing. But here was a treaty that could not bear for there to be a plan B, because the very existence of a plan B would affect plan A. It could only experience the no vote. It couldn't incorporate it in any way. It couldn't take on this opposition and write a new document or appease people's concerns, or it didn't know how to deal with the no vote in any way. The only thing it could do was to understand the no vote as a threat to its own existence. So this was a political process where the deal had been done, the document had been written, and a lot of politicians complain that we spent so much time on this document, and now the no vote is really ruining all that hard work that we've done. And so the only way that they can understand the no vote was as a threat to the existence of this document and to the existence of their political process. So I think that really what the Lisbon Treaty represented was a document that had come out of this elite process of negotiation, and that treated the encounter with the public in terms of the no vote as a process of threatening politics, of making this document grubby, people getting their hands on it, they didn't understand it, and that the document had to be protected from the public. This vote was a very live political moment. I think that all the no votes were very extraordinary moments when a certain sentiment reverberated around Europe and a certain realization became clear to people about the way that these institutions were working. And things could have worked out differently. If the economic crisis hadn't happened, the Irish vote might have gone the other way. And if the Irish vote had gone the other way, then that would have been a genuine political crisis for this method of doing politics. However, that didn't happen, and I think that moment has now closed. Even the Czech president is now saying, the Lisbon Treaty is an unstoppable train. He's sort of using the same railway metaphors of getting things back on track and that kind of thing, that the European politicians use themselves. So I think that political moment is now closed, and there's not that much more that can be done about it. So the question for us now is, where can we go next? So what are the ways in which the European Union and this elite way of doing politics can be campaigned against? I think that there's a certain paradox with people campaigning against the EU, which is they get caught up in the system they hate. So, you win your Eurosceptic election, and then you essentially live off Brussels, and you move to Brussels, and you live in the world of Brussels, and that becomes, you're a little England in a corner of Brussels. And so I think that there is something about campaigning against Brussels, which means you get caught up with it, and that becomes essentially you become part of the same elite political sphere, and that's the place where you kind of make your case. There is a problem, which is that because of political disengagement, and because the EU is built on political disengagement, no one really cares about it. I tried to sell an article around the time of the EU elections about how disengaged people were from the EU, and all the papers I spoke to said, yeah, but everyone's disengaged and no one cares about it, no one's interested. And one said, every time I mention Europe, the editor's eyes glaze over. And that was a very common response. There was a difficulty in criticising an organisation which is built on disengagement. But I do think it does make sense to be campaigning at a European level. I think that just as the European elites have lined up against us, it makes sense for us to line up in response against them. And I think that the very similarity of many of the laws being brought through in Europe means that there is a potential for forming cross-European networks. So I think that what we're trying to do at the Manifesto Club, the way I'd see our next step, which may not be the libertarian sort of critique, but the way that I see what we'd want to try and do next, is very much to start to organise cross-European campaigns on these issues of management and regulation. So against the smoking ban, against booze bans, against the regulation of hate speech, and through that to try and form more of a genuine European alliance on the issues that are alive in political life, on the things that people really want to do, on the ways in which people can experience the state intrusion in their life as a violation, and something that they care about. So I think that for me would be the challenge of the next 5 years, and probably more productive than getting involved in a critique of Brussels at this point, because I think that the moment of the Lisbon Treaty has very much gone now, and so I think it's sort of time for a new chapter in politics begin.
Thank you very much, Josie. We are going to take questions from the audience, and I can see already arms raised, but I would like to use my position as chairing this session to start and asking you one question. I think that what you have said is more a democratic critique of the European Union than a libertarian one. Because I think that the reasons why certain countries or certain swathes of population and the majority of voters in France rejected the European Union is that it was too liberal. It was promoting values that were not socialist, that were not redistributionist, that were not regulation of everyday life. So I think it is it's difficult to adjust a critique of the European Union because you have several currents that are working together, and actually the European Union has done a lot to make certain countries, including mine, including France, but I would say Greece, I would say others, freer than they were under their own government, and that they would have remained without the European Union.
On the same basis, you could say that just because the House of Lords makes a good decision, then therefore it's a good thing. I mean,
yes,
I think
yes, I think it is, yeah.
well, I would say no.
I think that it is given the context.
You know, if some a group of landowners or whatever who've inherited it from their great-great-great-grandfather, if they make the right decision, it's still wrong, because the basis of their political authority is wrong. It should, you know, people making decisions should not owe it to some bust in the hall. So I mean, I would say that even if the European Union made the right decision, and it was still wrong, because the basis of political authority was essentially that something that hadn't been argued for, hadn't been justified, and therefore it was illegitimate. But I think you make a really good point about the complicated nature of the no vote. And in all those different countries, the reasons why people voted no were very different. Obviously in Ireland you had all those opinion polls to do with, you know, abortion and the army and all those kinds of things. But I think that what was common in France, there was a socialist movement against liberalism, and something very different, completely opposite in Holland actually. But what you had what was in common to all those no votes was the way in which the Yes campaign actually created its own no vote. So what you saw in every case was that the Yes started out winning for various reasons. And in the course of the campaign, the way that they conducted it, which is essentially what they did in every case, was to tell people that they could only vote one thing, and was to take people's votes for granted. That created a reaction which I think was truly radical in content, which was people's sense of, you will not take me for granted, there must be an option, and I will not do what you say. And so I think that in as much as there was a commonality to all those no votes, it was the rejection of the fait accompli, the rejection of the done deal. And that was something that the Yes campaign created for itself in every instance by essentially taking people for granted and telling them they could only vote for one thing.
Gentleman here.
Yes, I found the speech very interesting, but I'm just wondering if that is the main critique I would have to the European Union, because you're criticizing the political culture in the European Union, basically, but that assumes a little bit that there could be a better political culture for the European Union, and therefore, under other circumstances, the European Union would be a good thing to have. And I think more like it's generally a very bad idea to centralize power somewhere, even when it would be more democratic, like it is now. And what's your point on that?
Yeah, I guess we probably just disagree a little bit philosophically. I wouldn't actually have any objection to a genuine European Parliament if it was voted for across Europe. I think actually a genuine political election campaign where for the position, for example, of European president would be quite interesting. I think that politics has become far too narrow. Everyone in London is concerned with London and nowhere else, and knows very little about European politics as a whole. So I actually, if Europe, so long as a government is based on political discussion and is as open as possible and things are argued as possible, I don't really care whether it's this unit or that unit. The reason why a European Parliament wouldn't make sense now is because there is no indigenous political sentiment across Europe. People are not arguing, and we're not a polity in that way. So that's the only reason why it would make sense. But myself, for me, the question is whether it's democratic and open and accountable, and whether those arguments have happened. And if they have, then I have no particular attachment to England or UK or this unit or that unit. So I think that would be, it would be a philosophical genus.
Nick Cohen, and then the gentleman over there, and who's, I can't distinguish, and then cousin after that. Nick.
Actually, I can only emphasise the point you were making about the smoking ban and the kind of socialisation of kind of elites in other nations around Europe, because actually I find that it's going a bit further afield. I was actually in Bodrum over the summer, and I thought it was very civilised. I mean, you could go, you could smoke in the clubs, it was fine. They had tequila in these little booths on the beach. I don't think they had any licensing whatsoever, so like all this alcohol and anything you wanted was really, available in a very kind of liberal way. I was thinking, oh wow, well maybe Turkey might be able to save Western civilization while while we sort of decay into authoritarianism for a few years, but as long as this is here, perhaps, we'll survive. Perhaps the idea will survive and eventually, transplant back again. But tragically, on the very day I left, they introduced a smoking ban on interior areas, and I imagine, because I can't imagine there being any indigenous political interest in banning smoking in Turkey of all places. So I'm guessing it's probably just to impress the EU.
Gentleman over there.
You mentioned several forms of harmonization. Do you think there will be a further drive to harmonize tax rates and stamp out tax competition between nations? And how does that fit into your libertarian critique of the EU?
There you go.
I'm not sure it does actually. I think basically I was looking at much more as a kind of a way of regulating political life. I think that the form of economic cooperation is a much longer standing one in terms of the EU. I think that the novel development in the 90s was to take areas of national policy making into the sphere of Brussels. Just on Nick's point, I completely agree about Eastern Europe being a sort of bastion of liberty at the moment. I've got a contact from Bulgaria, and she's absolutely horrified by the laws that get brought through here. And she says that in Bulgaria, if anyone tries to tell you not to do something, then they just laugh and they go, "Oh no, you're being communist." And she says that CCTV cameras, they never last very long because the gypsies steal them. It sounds like a great place. And so I think that there is a way in which. But the way in which getting brought into Brussels means they start passing, the domestic violence laws and the booze ban and the smoking ban laws, and that becomes the way in which they show they're European and they are good Europeans. And there is a kind of, with the Eastern European delegates at these kind of cross-European conferences, there's a kind of apologetic, I don't know what social inclusion means. And then they learn to use social inclusion, and by the end of the conference they're talking about social inclusion. And so there is a kind of apologetic kind of learning of the words and being incorporated into the European political elite, and then going back and trying to civilize their people.
A short question from Ben, and because after that there are many other questions, Chris and so on. So.
You argue basically for as democratic a form of the EU as possible, and yet you point out, I think rightly, that there is no common sentiment amongst the peoples of Europe sufficient to sustain genuine Europe-wide parties, for example, and so on. It seems to me, therefore, that libertarianism and democratization actually are in essence in harmony, and that harmony leads towards the repatriation of politics, even if it puts Christian's fellow Frenchmen who are largely socialistic back in the saddle. It was notable, surely, that in all the things that were said against Václav Klaus and his assertion of Czech democratic rights, nobody said he was doing it in order to preserve the theft of the Sudeten Germans' property.
Mm-hmm.
No, I have a lot of sympathy with that. I mean, I guess I think there is a challenge to start to build more cross-European sympathy. Only as a kind of pragmatic political point, which is that if the elites are working this way, if they're all passing their smoking bans this way, and they're all making their policy this way, then there is an objective sense in which they have a common political interest, and we therefore have a common political interest against them. I think that this potential political union has been very little exploited. The only cross-European movements really are sort of anti-Brussels ones. But I think that there is a nascent potential there to build those sorts of linkages. I mean, I wouldn't be calling for European Parliament. I think it's an irrelevant question. But I think that right now that there is a political potential to start to build more kind of alliances more campaigns for freedom on a European level, which then might start to actually create more of those links.
Chris Marsey, the Communications Director of the UK Libertarian Party. There are several points I want to make, really. I'm going to make them very, very brief. The first point, I think, is that it's very interesting the guy at the front there should say that democracy is compatible with libertarianism, because I don't think it is. I think democracy is the tyranny of the majority, or in this country is the tyranny of the minority. We had a government elected by 22% of the electorate. Which brings me on really to the whole idea of, we have this idea of the European Union. We have, despite the no votes, many people say these no votes were made on purely local issues, not really about the idea of a rule by a supranational parliament. Do you think that the essential acquiescence of the European peoples to the European Union is based on the fact that the majority of people throughout the European Union actually want to be ruled by technocrats and want to be ruled by people who essentially take the decisions, the hard decisions, out of their hands?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. We answer each question one after the other.
Okay, so fine. Okay.
But I simply signal to the people who carry the mics where the next, so that they can already move to that part of the room. So go on.
Okay. No, I think that I'm not sure people want to be ruled by technocrats. I think that there is a kind of cynicism about people's sense of their ability to do anything about it. So I mean, I think that kind of whenever I talk about freedom issues with people, they always say, "Oh yeah, well they're just bringing through more laws." They would do that, wouldn't they? There's nothing you can do about it. I think there is a kind of popular anger which takes the form of a kind of cynicism, in the sense that things really can't be changed. Having said that, I think that there is something about a kind of the comfort of the rule. So there is something about people kind of wanting others to make decisions for them, and just because that in human nature, life is much easier if there is a kind of agreed set of procedures and you don't have to decide anything for yourself, etc., etc. But I think that the dominant attitude towards the EU, and the one that came out whenever there was any kind of spark. So I think the response to the Irish vote was amazing. There was a real immediate sense that of anger against the European elite, against politicians, and against the idea that these people make all our decisions for us, they never listen to us. And so I think that whenever you've had a kind of a moment of political dynamism, as opposed to just, when people don't discuss this, then that sentiment's become very clear. So I think that the challenge then is to take that kind of cynicism into something more positive. And so not just to say, oh, these people making all the decisions, nothing we can do about it, but kind of, well, what can we do about it then? But that's not an easy question. It's not something that can be done overnight.
Yes, we do.
Slightly devil's advocate. Does the prospect of free trade, free movement of people, freer movement of capital trump all the downsides? Is the value of free trade more than all this hideous stuff that we all know about and hate? Given that most of you are probably, the political leaders who are in power, will probably clamp down on free trade, clamp down on free movement of people and capital and taxes there.
I mean, I think that one of the benefits, probably the only benefit of the European Union, has been the right to live and work in any European country, the ease with which you can do transactions with lots of different countries without getting a cut every time with changing currency. So I think that there is, and if Europe was only about making things easier to work with people from different countries and move borders and move money, then that would be a good thing. I think almost that's the smallest part of what the European Union has done. And whatever we do, then it would be good to preserve that and extend that. I mean, I think you could have a lot more movement than there is already.
Isn't the value of that more than the cost of all the other things?
But can't you get rid of all the regulation and keep the free movement? I mean, I think that if you're rid of regulation, you should have more free movement than at present rather than less.
Bruce. No, sorry.
Tony, actually.
Yeah.
doesn't it to some extent depend where you're coming from? If you are Moldovan or Ukrainian or Belarusian, then the EU still represents a step in the right direction and a beacon of sort of potential liberty and freedom, both economic and political. If you look at the history of UK-EU relations, at one stage the EU was seen actually as a bastion and bulwark against the impact of Labour Benite socialism, and then of course you have the Thatcher Revolution and the roles are reversed. And although I, as a libertarian, very much agree with your overall approach, and in particular, I think there would be myriad benefits from a sort of process of deregulation, controlling bureaucratic capture and all that goes with it. Nonetheless, doesn't it depend where you're coming from?
Yeah, I think it does, but I don't. I think that the attraction of the EU to Eastern European countries, the gloss soon wears off. I've met kind of countless, people from Ukraine or wherever, and they started out very kind of, oh, this is very exciting and pro-European, and then they become very, very jaded and cynical and, sort of disenchanted, basically. And I think the reason for that is because the European political culture they're being socialised into is bland and meaningless, and without any kind of meat. So they often start out quite enthusiastic, and then they meet a few of these meetings and they start kind of saying, this is all a kind of plot and that kind of thing. So I think that gloss sort of wears off. What was the second part of your question?
I sort of agree with you about bureaucracy and perhaps whether it's possible to overturn the process of bureaucratic capture, and if so, how you do it.
At a European level?
Yes.
I think that is bureaucratic capture, sorry.
It's the process by which you build a consensus around the imposition of a bureaucratic regulatory structure which is common and which you're not allowed to depart from. The overall impact of which is to remove both individual and, dare I use the word, corporate liberty.
Yeah, I completely agree with your characterisation, and I think that the process of challenging that, I think it has never really been tried. So I think that you could achieve quite a lot by making the first steps in that direction, by trying to campaign on freedom issues that are common in different European countries.
It is significant that all the big companies have their lobby group in Brussels, which saves them a lot of expenses, because instead of having lobby groups in 17, 20 different countries, they can go to just one spot and get what they want in terms of, whether they are farmers or whether they are big corporations and so on, they get all they want for 400 million people.
That's a lot easier. But I think that there is something, I thought of another point, which was that you were right about the right went to Europe as a way of avoiding the left, and the left went to Europe as a way of avoiding the right. And I think the mistake of both was to think that they could get the easy route, and they could get their policies through without ever having the national argument. So certainly from the point of view of the left, they all started looking to Europe once they became disillusioned with their own organisations and when they were really on the back foot. So they just thought, we'll get it through this guy, in this committee, and therefore the policy comes in. And you've seen very much politicians trying to get through their favoured law. They failed in a parliamentary vote, so they go to Brussels. So Blunkett did that a lot with some kind of the surveillance kind of bills that he couldn't get through Parliament, he got through Brussels instead. I think in every case it's a mistake, because you're essentially trying to win the argument without having it. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think these the gentleman over there and Tom Borrows will take the two questions very quickly, please, and then we'll break for coffee.
I think it's quickly. Beyond the Germany invaded France, And then we got the Maginot Line as a result. Then the largest work right out of sheet ground. Is the European Union an answer to defending the German problem?
And Tom Burrows, yeah, that's right. Thank you very much. Tom.
That was really more a quick observation than anything else. I mean, one thing I find in my day job is that I cover the banking industry, is the enormous amount of pressure that European Union's various governments like to bring against the naughty boy of Switzerland. And I can't help believe that one of the reasons why Switzerland constantly gets it in the neck is not because of its bank secrecy laws or because it's rich or it's got, it's because it doesn't want to sign up to the European Union. And they just can't comprehend that this country doesn't want to join. Well, what's wrong with these people?
I think that's very common sentiments, like why don't they want to be in the club? And you know, some of the aggression levelled at the Irish politicians after the Irish no vote was really phenomenal. You know, it's like, you know, these people are so ungrateful and essentially just kind of, you know, kind of language that you just don't normally hear. So I think there is a kind of sentiment of anyone who doesn't want to be in that club is just treated as a total, a total hour. Yeah.
In a way, it's quite bristle. I mean, if that's apparent with any kind of debate, in a way, it's quite encouraging because it means that there's something wrong with them.
No, I think that's the case, and it is, you know, it's the kind of the private boys club, and they can't understand why someone doesn't want to be in their gang, sort of thing.
We have to break here for coffee. Josie, thank you very much. Join me in thanking you.